Hey, give me. Hello, and welcome to Lore Chat. I am Josh Colon, your social media guide and friend. And of course, with me is the legendary, the amazing Doug Seacat.
You're doing Big Hands Day?
Big Hands Day.
All right.
It's big excitement.
Yeah, sure.
Times. I'm really excited to have you here.
Yeah, bonus Lore Chat.
Bonus Lore Chat, very exciting.
Not just on Wednesdays.
Not just on Wednesdays, not replacing anything, just here in its own slot. Like it deserves to be.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Like it always deserves to be. So let's do some housekeeping first.
Yeah.
Let's go through it, Tony. Hit us with it. So here's our schedule. We have Dev Hangout on Wednesdays at 10 a.m., followed by Get Your Paint On Thursdays, also at 10 a.m. We do have our monthly staff showdown. And next week, on May 24th, we have Primecast Live, which is where we all hang out and talk about cool things and preview things.
So we don't have a date for the next staff showdown yet?
We do not. Tony's shaking his head.
It'll happen at some point.
Emphatically. We just had one a couple weeks ago, so it's coming up.
They got some time.
That's right. And then we've got mini crate things. Oh my gosh, so this is your last week to get Asphyxius the Undamned. You want to get human Asphyxius before he died? Now's your chance. It ends on Sunday, I believe.
Pre-volcano Asphyxius.
Pre-horrible death and burns
Yes.
Asphyxius. And if you get
fourth degree burns.
Fourth degree, pretty much all the way down to the skull. And if you get the VIP, which is a year subscription, you get the Bride of Arcadius, which is a really fun take on Dr. Arcadius. It includes her little pig under her arm.
Yeah.
Which is a delightful little detail.
With a little Band-Aid.
With a little Band-Aid on its butt. And then, of course, you've got the Legend of the Five Rings. We've got Moto Chagatai of the Unicorn Clan. And the VIP year subscription is Shosoru Sadako of the Scorpion Clan. And you can get Moto up until June 5th. And these sculpts are fantastic. I've seen them.
Yeah, they look great.
I've seen my head. They're just tremendous. And then after that, we've got Lock and Load 2019. Get your tickets now. June 21st to the 23rd. We believe there are still some hotel rooms available. There are still tickets. And you don't want to miss it. We've got some really special exclusives like the female Doom Reavers and Zaal, the Ancestral Eye, which is Doug Hamilton's crazy Egyptian version of Zaal.
After his trip to Egypt, he was inspired.
He was inspired, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful piece. And some extra goodies that we haven't revealed yet, but there's some awesome stuff. And I think that's it for house cleaning. All right. So today we're talking about some really cool. Doug, what are we talking about today?
Today I wanted to talk a little bit about some subversive groups and secret societies. When we were working on a lot of the infernal material, getting into cabals and plotting and scheming, but we were going over some of our sort of secret society, subversive groups in the setting, and there's a lot of them. Like this could be a recurring larger category.
Right.
In fact, all of the groups I'll be talking about today could be their own topic, if we wanted to really drill down into them. But one of the things that we wanted to talk about as we were looking at the different groups that we could approach is there's a number of our groups that are both subversive but also sort of mainstay parts of the faction.
Right.
They're not real. These aren't really secret societies. These first groups that we're going to talk about, but they do have secretive aspects. They have things that they're doing that are considered potentially subversive, not necessarily in keeping with the leadership of the faction. And so we kind of wanted to get into that a little bit. I think some of these groups are among our favorites. They add some fun complexity to the factions, and I think allow us to kind of highlight the fact that even in any given faction, you have people that believe different things and are working for different goals and agendas. And sometimes that leads to things like infernalist cults. But other times, maybe you just want things to be a little different in your nation, or you have you're making change from within, trying to seek change from within. And most of the groups that we're talking about today are definitely more legitimate groups than some other ones that we could have picked.
Yeah, they're still emblematic to a certain extent of the faction.
Yeah, which I think is kind of a fun edge. Like one of the things we've tried to do with each of our factions is to provide different themes, different groups within the faction that kind of, you could kind of steer an army around, or you could have it be just kind of like one little element off to the side.
Right.
And so one of the first groups I wanted to talk about is the Kayazi of Khador. And this is one of my favorite kind of echelons of society, which is a group of merchant princes who are also, they're basically sort of robber barons.
Right.
Let's see if Tony can find the right image, or we could just look at wooden slats. That's totally legit.
That's emblematic in its own way.
Sure.
Technical
but anyway,
difficulties.
The idea with the Kayazi is they're merchant princes, they're robber barons, they're sort of mainstays of Khadoran industry and the economy of Khador. They've been hugely responsible for modernizing the nation, but they're also crime bosses in many ways, or at least they're sponsoring the crime bosses.
Right.
They're kind of the ones who are, they have assassins in their employ. They rely on braccias, which are sort of street gangs, as muscle to enforce their agendas. And so you kind of have this great combination of legitimate and criminal enterprise being controlled by this very powerful cast of commoners who don't necessarily always have a lot of direct political clout.
Exactly. What I love about the Kayazi is that they're kind of like the antithesis to the great princes, right? Like they're not born noble. They kind of like, kind of put themselves up by their bootstraps through crime.
Right.
But have gained.
But not always crime.
Not always crime, that's true. Through legitimate business as well.
Yeah, and I think in many cases the Kayazi, like the sort of the core root of their power is usually more of a legitimate industry, but then in order to preserve their industry, in order to kind of preserve their base of power, they rely on these criminal allies.
Right.
To be their muscle, to be their enforcers. And it's really reflective of kind of the overall nature of Khador in general, where, like you mentioned with the Great Princes, one of the interesting things is like the Kayazi and the Great Princes kind of are forced to sort of work together in this to get things done.
Right.
Like we kind of have it set up where the Great Princes in Khador are basically each considered sort of a sovereign. There is the Empress, there is, who used to be the Queen, but there, now the Empress definitely has absolute power, one of our strongest monarchs in our setting. But at the same time, this comes out of tradition of these Great Princes, each of which has sort of sovereign power within their territory.
Right.
And so there's like a lot of cultural and tangible power. They're the ones that own the land. They're the ones who get to assign offices, in their regions. But in some cases, especially in some of the more like rustic, rural parts of Khador, like some of these Great Princes don't have a lot of money.
Right.
And so, especially as Khador kind of became a more modern nation, what we showed within kind of the last century in Khador is, they in order to compete with their main rival, Signar, which was very advanced technologically, had a lot of powerful industry and had kind of modernized their cities. Khador had to do the same thing, and we had that happen under the Vinar dynasty, and particularly the current Great Vizier, Simonyev Blastavia. He was himself a member of the Kayazi merchant prince class, and he was in charge of the nation during his regency, when the empress was too young to kind of take over for real. And basically during this whole period, they like fostered modernization in industry in Khador. They basically created like a middle class that really wasn't there before. And so suddenly you have a lot of people that aren't nobles, but they do have a lot of wealth. They become vital to like the industry of the nation. They also become vital to like the war effort. Like you can't have all of the cool man of war and warjacks.
Colossals. We've seen that they funded the first Colossals and the Behemoth, I think, too.
Well, and a lot of the raw resources that Khador needs to make their military work, you have to have these efforts of these Kayazi who are running these industries. And but at any moment, like these people could be shut down or locked away, or if they defy the great princes have the legal authority. So they kind of are forced into this situation where they don't have access to like all these armed vassals and retainers to kind of see their work put through. So sometimes you go to street gangs. Right. And especially the city of Kursk, which is, the capital, we've kind of talked about like I would personally love to see like a Grand Theft Auto style game set within Kursk, where it's like open sandbox of like, these gangs running around the city.
That's awesome.
But you would have these echelons of like, you got the street gangs on one level that are just, hassling people, extorting people, but then higher up, they're answering to these merchant princes who like one of them might be in charge of like all the factories, in the city or something like that.
So, and we've shown with Vlad throughout the years that there's a rivalry kind of between the great princes and the Kayazi.
Sure.
Like when he died, I remember it being specific, when Vlad was presumed dead.
Oh, right. I was like, he's not dead.
I know, but for a while they thought he was dead, and the Kayazi were like trying to fight to get a hold of like his money or something. Like they were definitely like trying to fight, for.
Well, I think in particular in the conquered territories, like, what eventually became unified Umbri, you did have like all these opportunities open up where like the Khadoran army seizes all these lands in kind of a wealthy area, in sort of just what was east of what used to be Khador before. You get into these new lands. You had all these merchant princes kind of moving into the region and taking over, especially because there's like a lot of useful industry in like the capital in Merowan and so on. And so we kind of showed in some of our fiction these merchant princes getting power, and then you suddenly have some of these assassins, hanging out alongside the military, and we've kind of shown that there's some tensions there. Like they aren't necessarily reporting to like the same chain of command, but they are supposed to cooperate with the military. Like ultimately, any of these criminal organizations could be shut down, if they become too big of a problem. But the whole atmosphere that Empress Vinar and Blostavia have set up is like in support of these guys. Like I think it's part of the sort of the brilliant balancing act that the Empress has done in several ways. Like we've shown that she's kind of balanced, the majority religions with each other, but she's also had to kind of like temper her nobles and the Kayazi and like make sure they're both kind of working toward the same ends. And that's all difficult. Like you need to have a shrewd politician to make some of that work.
So do you have a sense of how the Kayazi assassins in particular came to become sort of a pseudo part of the military?
Well, I don't think of them as much as a part of the military as like they're almost like the irregulars, where like they're an asset that is good at killing things and that has certain skills, especially of being able to kind of be sneaky, a little covert. So you can consider them like another asset that you can rely on, but also especially as we showed kind of Khador moving into these conquered territories, and that's where the fighting is happening. It's like now the Kayazi's interests are being threatened by military actions, and so they're volunteering help. They're like, hey, we've got some people. They may have evaded their conscription duties technically, because that's another thing that's kind of fun. Like if you look in the background, like in Kings, Nations, and Gods, we talk about Khador having kind of universal conscription, like you're supposed to serve in the military, but there are some exceptions, but they're sort of on the fringe. Like so in some of our wilderness areas, you can serve by kind of just helping out as an irregular, where you're like a guide, you're a military tracker, you're a scout, and that gives you a dispensation to avoid joining the Winter Guard. But similarly, like among the street gangs, like it's part of a matter of pride that they don't join up. They're not conscripted. So in theory, like a lot of those Kayazi assassins that you see are basically probably could be locked up for evading conscription. And so, but maybe you kind of let that slide as long as they're willing to kind of fight alongside the Winter Guard occasionally, murder some Signaran officers when need be, that kind of thing.
Is there any opportunity in the Senate? We never really addressed this, but is a possibility that like some of that, those connections came from, there might be some graft and bribery happening
Sure.
within like the merchant princes, the Kayazi, having some pull with some higher officials, right? Just
Sure.
buying them off and things like
And
that.
I think in some cases it's not even like illegal bribery. Like that's one of the ways that the Kayazi actually have power in the capital is through like negotiating, leveraging their wealth. Their like there could be legitimate reasons why, it's good to be on their good side, where like they'll make things go a little more smoothly in your territory. And so there can be a fine line between like extortion and you're just kind of helping out one of the great princes out of a patriotic duty.
Right.
but I do think it's kind of interesting with the Kayazi and the Brachas. They're almost like, especially because we've kind of emphasized how important patriotism is in Khador, and you see among this kind of criminal underworld, they're not as patriotic as necessarily everybody else, or it's a different kind of patriotism, and there's this sort of independent streak, and that's why we kind of talk like that's why they qualify for our discussion today. They are a little bit of a subversive group. Like we've shown that they are willing to put their own interests ahead of Khadoran objectives from time to time, or it's one of those things where like you don't want to piss off the Empress too badly. Like you can't be completely subversive to her goals, but you could sort of like delay, fulfilling some of your industrial obligations. Like there could all of a sudden be like some workers' strikes,
Right.
or suddenly those iron shipments aren't making it to the capital
they're
on
delayed,
time.
yeah.
And technically the military could crack down on that, but that's not necessarily the swiftest or most efficient way to resolve the problem. Sometimes maybe you just allow them whatever little leeway that they would have. So there's this kind of like, each side scratching the other one's back. And it is a degree of corruption, but it's also like integral to the government. It's kind of like just a part of how the government works, is there's like an acknowledgement of the Empress's power and her supremacy, but at the same time, for the nation to work and to be modern, she needs these brilliant merchant princes to be kind of like with the program.
So we never really just got into, we've thrown hints, especially in the RPG, a little bit about the Kayazi, setting slight influence outside of Khador a little bit,
Yeah.
Putting in like, in order and things like that. As a secret society or as a subversive group,
Sure.
what would you say are some of their long-term goals, right? Like what do you see, where do the Kayazi see themselves in 10 to 20 years?
I do think it's largely a matter of wealth. I mean, there could be other plots and conspiracies going on, but I think for the most part, they're wanting to control their industry. They're wanting to achieve the greatest power that they can, given that they aren't of noble blood. And one of the other things that's kind of fun within like the notion of intrigue and politics in Khador is that we've got like with Simonyev, the Great Vizier, he's also the guy in charge of our espionage organizations, like the
Section 3.
Section 3 and the Precast Chancellery, which are internal security forces, like making sure that some of these guys aren't actually scheming too much against the government and being willing to shut them down if need be. So you kind of have this like internal spy game going on. But I feel like we've probably spent enough time on the Kazi, unless you've seen some cool questions that you want. I think we will have a little Q&A.
We'll have a little Q&A towards the end.
But let me see if there were any, let's see.
Are the Great Princes and Horse Lords the same group? They're related, right? Some Great
Yeah,
Princes are the Horse Lord, or descended from Horse Lords, right?
Yeah, I think especially in among the Umbrian and the Cardic cultures, we do see that like the whole idea would be that if you're a Khadoran noble, you're probably going to claim descent from the Horse Lords. Like even if maybe you don't ride a horse so much anymore.
Right.
Like, you know, not everybody has to be on a horse all the time.
Sure.
But I do think there's some great princes in particular, or you know, some rulers who that's still a part of their identity.
Well, that's the thing, obviously, about the Kazi is, like, as you said, you know, wealth is part of their long-term goal, but once you have all the wealth, inevitably you want political, you know, power.
Well,
to
the
some
two
degree.
go hand in hand.
Yeah,
too.
so it's not within the realm of possibility that the Kazi start making grander designs in
Sure.
the future somehow.
Oh, sure.
In different ways. But yeah.
Well, and I think one of the important things with kind of the world, the scope of our world growing a little bit from time to time, like we've kind of shown how Khador has, you know, colonies on Zu. They've got maybe expeditions going into the Alkier subcontinent. So like the Kazi are probably really important behind some of those efforts to like break into new markets, get a hold of resources beyond the norm.
Right.
And so that puts them in a pretty powerful position, because like suddenly they could have a power base where the Khadoran nobles pretty much have no oversight or, you know, power there. And so I think this notion of kind of branching out to other shores, other ports, is something that where the Kazi have a real advantage over, you know, their more sort of traditional rivals.
Interesting. Very cool.
Yeah. So we should probably move to our second group.
To our second group, sure.
So you know, I saw some people asking about the Protectorate. We actually did want to talk a little bit about what some people might not consider to be a subversive group, but that I think is actually really interesting in this discussion, which is the Order of the Wall in the Protectorate of Menoth. And so one of the things that I think is really fascinating about the Order of the Wall is how they're kind of set against the ethos of their faction to some regards.
Right.
And they kind of have a special niche within the Protectorate. They're not a secret society. They aren't considered a subversive society, you know, as far as how they describe themselves.
Right.
But at the same time, their ethos is so different from those who are in power that they've kind of been put in a position of becoming subversive, especially through a couple of our major characters that we've, you know, featured in the fiction. Darton Vilmon and Anson Durst are our first and only Order of the Wall warcaster.
That's right.
So anyway, wanted to get into this a little bit. Just as a slight aside, it's worth noting that our friend here, Josh Cologne, has a special relationship with the Paladins of the Order of the Wall. This is basically one of your favorite groups.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the Iron Kingdom setting.
Absolutely.
And I just remember one of my first memories of Josh is him as, you know, a wee lad. A young person at Gen Con, you know, at one of these press gang parties, where, you know, we had been working hard on the floor all day, and then suddenly Josh comes up to me and starts drilling me with questions about the Order of the Wall, you know, just wanting to know everything about him. And basically, like, I had this insight as I was talking to Josh, this young Josh, sort of naive and open-minded. Like, he kind of wanted me to reassure him that Menoth was not mean. Like that Menoth could be a caring and loving God, because there's the Order of the Wall when we've got Darton Vilmon. Like, clearly Menoth cannot be such an angry creator of man. And I had to kind of let him down. I had to tell him, no, like the Protectorate is harsh and brutal, and they love setting people on fire, and, you know, all of these things. But we do have the Order of the Wall as this sort of like kernel of compassion, you know, assailed on all sides. But I think, you know, it's interesting that the Protectorate was the faction that you chose, but you chose to reject all of its crusading.
The core tenets of the faction.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting, and because the Order of the Wall spoke to you on a certain level of this noble group that kind of seemed to have this desire to self-sacrifice and so on. So, what was your feeling with the Order of the Wall, as far as, like, I know that kind of steered your interest in War Machine.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, a lot of people know when they pick up War Machine or Hordes, and they get that first demo, is usually they pick a faction a lot of times by look. I've given
Sure.
I've given demos since I was like 16 years old.
Right.
I've given thousands of demos, literally thousands. And a lot of the times people will pick their first faction just because of the way it looks. And so I chose to Protectorate because I love that aesthetic that they
Right.
had. But when I started reading the lore, it was the Order of the Wall that hit me. And it's something we talked about in a recent lunch, you and I, where we talked about, you hit the nail on the head when you said, like, what really intrigues me about the Order of the Wall is that they use mercy and compassion as an act of defiance.
Right.
Right? Like they choose to be merciful as despite the fact that literally everyone in authority in the Protectorate does not want them to be that way.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're true to their code, and there's very interesting dichotomy. And they're not the only group like that in the setting. There's definitely
Sure.
groups that have to toe that line, but in a group and faction that is so about like law and following the harsh dictates
And obedience.
and obedience, having a group that tries to be obedient and is good at what they do,
Right.
but is able to do it by taking care of people who are Menites and non-Menites alike, is awesome
Right,
to me.
and I've gotten into plenty of arguments with Josh on that particular point in particular. So like it's like Josh is always like, but the paladins would save anybody, like, you know, believers, non-believers, and I'm like, well, I think believers still get preferential treatment. Like if you've got two people lying there bleeding out, one of whom is a Menite, one of whom is not. You
Right.
gotta save the Menite first.
I mean, whatever. I mean,
But-
depends on who's writing it, I guess.
But I do think there's something fascinating with the Order of the Wall, and one of the things that I think that intrigues me about them and that makes them compelling is they're also one of our oldest organizations. So we kind of set it up to where, you know, as we know, the Protectorate of Menoth, they consider themselves the inheritor of an ancient tradition, but the Protectorate hasn't been around that long. It's only a couple hundred years old.
Right.
And but the Order of the Wall's roots extend way, way back to basically like the dawn of Menite civilization. And you know, so we've had some fun in the fiction and in our background, kind of getting into those origins a bit, where we had, you know, they consider Valiant of Thrace to be they're sort of the first paladin, like the beginning of the Order of the Wall, and
And he's one of the great priest kings. Right?
yeah, well, and he's kind of the founder of Calatia, which became Caspia. And the thing that's kind of interesting is we have a variety of superlative groups. And I always have to be careful, like when we're editing, because we always want to say like this group is the oldest, this is the first, this is the whatever. But the Order of the Wall I think has the best claim to being the oldest, continuous organization of humanity in the Iron Kingdoms.
Damn
They
straight.
even predate the Circle Ouroboros, which often makes that claim.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being, like the Circle doesn't really trace its origins like as an organization until after the fall of the Mulgur,
Right.
and Priest King Gullivant, and that's centuries later. Like that's well after Valiant of Thrace kind of set the foundation. And just like one of my favorite things about the Order of the Wall and kind of the Menite belief in the wall itself is this idea of, that goes back to the very beginning of civilization, of the wall separates us from the beasts and the wild things in the darkness. And so like there's a purity to the paladin origin that is so central to the Menite religion. It's like they are part of that wall that is protecting those who are hiding. They're by the fire, and you build a wall to keep the ravenous horde at bay. And in the early days of Menite civilization, they really were outnumbered. It's like they're just trying to set up their cities and their walled, places, and there's like teeming hordes of Trollkin, Ogren, and human barbarians out there, ready to eat their hearts, and it's a pretty savage time. And so there's none of that sort of moral complexity or uncertainties that happen in the modern era with the complexities of the Scrutators,
Right.
and all of that. It was just like
It was a brutal time, but a simpler time.
a brutal, simple time. But the Paladins harken back to that, and so they consider themselves part of that same organization that was standing on the wall in those ancient times. And so they're also, because of that, because of their antiquity, they're one of the few groups, even in the Protectorate. Like the Protectorate kind of was almost like a reformation of the Mennonite religion. Like the Mennonite religion had fractured across the Iron Kingdoms, where there wasn't like one temple that was standing for everybody. It's like you had Mennonites in every kingdom. There was like dozens of different ways to interpret the true law. And but the Order of the Wall kind of had its deeper foundation, and so when the Protectorate, in the Signarin Civil War, when the Protectorate breaks off, sets up their own beliefs, their own systems, the Order of the Wall kind of remained largely intact to some degree. I mean, they kind of unified, but like, even in the modern era, one of the reasons why they feel subversive is they're one of the few of our martial orders that doesn't have as its core tenet like obedience to the hierarch. Like their first duty is obedience to their code, and that's really not quite cool with everybody else in the Protectorate. Like the whole Scrutator caste is set up to like ensure the preservation of the faith and to support the hierarch.
Right.
And so like there's all of this temple hierarchy and structure and enforcement geared around making sure that everybody obeys the hierarch. And the Paladins haven't really said they're cool with that.
Because they predate that.
Well, and it's just part of their core tenets. Like the Exemplar, the Knights Exemplar, their entire core belief is obedience. Like that is the ultimate higher thing for them. Whereas with the Order of the Wall, it's protecting the innocent. It's protecting those who can't protect themselves. Their language does steer a little bit toward the faithful.
Sure.
Like I said, if you're going to protect anybody, protect the Mennonites first. Mm-hmm. But there still is that consideration of like, that's what it's all about. Yes, we should serve the hierarch as long as it is in the keeping of the code. And it's been kind of fun to show in the course of the fiction times where that's put in conflict, where like the Paladins are protectors of the temple, of the faith, but like, you can be put in a position where their code of protecting people is at odds with like the orders of the priests, of the scrutators. And that's been some fun source of drama in our fiction. And many of young Josh Cologne's questions to me at Gen Con involved like, but what if like a scrutator had ordered like murdering some people, there's a paladin standing nearby.
I'll never forget Gen Con 2008, Legends comes out.
Right.
And we'd already known each other for a couple of years. And
Yeah.
I was just kind of eager. I was like 18, 19 years old. And I walk up to you, and you knew me well enough to go like, did you read it yet? Like, Legends.
Yeah, because Legends I definitely knew would be.
And I'm like, no. It's like, read it tonight. We're going to talk tomorrow. There's something there for you.
Yeah, I was just looking forward to you reading that.
And then the next day I'm like, oh my God.
For people who don't remember, like in Legends is when we have the big act of defiance by Darton Vilmon, where he outright defies the hierarch. When the hierarch decides to, there's some, I don't want to get into the whole background, but the idea is there's some Signarin Mennonites who are willing to defect, but that are put sort of on a wall to try to slow down the Mennonite invasion of Caspia.
Who are about to win. They're about to win
they're
everything.
close to winning.
Yeah.
And so like Stryker, it's a smart move, but I mean, he's like, hey, if you guys would be willing to take a little break in the fight, here's some Mennonites that we'd be willing to, allow you to escort into your nation. You get some new citizens. And Voyle was like, you know what? I'd rather just destroy Caspia. Like, if we blow up a few Mennonites, sometimes these things happen, martyrs for the cause. But the Harbinger, this was one of my favorite scenes of dramatic tension. And to me, it really underscored kind of how a lot of these forces in the Protectorate work is you kind of have the hierarch made an order which the people there couldn't defy.
Fiora immediately started.
Fiora's like super happy to blow up whoever. She likes setting things on fire, blowing people up.
Yeah.
Now she'd rather blow up non-Mennonites, I think, to give her credit. But the hierarch gives her an order, she's gonna take those guys out. But so that's a moment where Vilmon is there and he just can't sit back. He can't allow this. He's like, okay, I'm not the one attacking these people, but I have to intervene. And the whole point being like he knows that he's accepting his own death when this happens. Like if he's gonna defy the hierarch, he's basically giving himself a death sentence. And he's willing to accept that. It's almost like an act of passive resistance. And it's surprising to him that the Harbinger actually martyrs herself to protect him. So to my mind, that's a really important scene because the Harbinger didn't stop the attack directly.
Right.
The Harbinger didn't actually openly defy the hierarch.
Right.
But she did save Vilmon in his act of defiance.
Right.
And that kind of becomes a precedent-setting event that kind of serves like later, like we have it where Vilmon almost gets killed twice. Like he later is put on trial for
Found
his
guilty.
act of defiance. He's found guilty, and it's Hierarch Severius based on the Harbinger's intervention pardons him. And it is a pardon, so it's an acknowledgement he did something wrong, but I'm going to allow it because the Order of the Wall is important. And the whole notion there is the Harbinger sees a place for these protectors, these, the Order of the Wall, but they are a fringe group. They are not, like in that moment, they stood in the way of Protectorate victory, basically. Like that stopped the whole attack in Caspia. That could have changed like the course of history in our setting.
And it led to the death of a hierarch,
Right.
Indirectly.
Yeah. So I think that's just like one of our real fun moments of drama with the Order of the Wall, where we kind of see them as they really are a subversive group, but they're operating under certain dictates. Like they aren't against the temple. They aren't even really against the Scrutator caste. It's just if they're put in a position where they have to choose between their code and obeying the priest, they might have to accept the fact that they're going to defy authority and potentially die in the process. Another slightly less grand, but I still think really important moment of similar conflict is one that we showed in Reckoning with Anson Durst. Durst's kind of a fun character because as a warcaster, and we wanted very specifically to make Durst not just like Vilmon in warcaster armor.
Right.
And Durst is a simpler person. He's not a philosopher. Like Vilmon is somebody who's educated, very intelligent. He kind of thinks about the philosophy of the order. But Durst is just a soldier. He's like, and he's a little thick, maybe. You could say he's not a philosopher.
He's unburdened by
certain complex thoughts. But at the same time, he does believe in the code. He has a stronger adherence to authority because of his place as a warcaster. Like he's kind of been trained and set up to be a general of the armies of the Protectorate.
He can't just think about the order. He has to think about the whole Protectorate.
His place. And so in Reckoning, we kind of had a fun scene where we have an alliance between Khador, Signar, and the Protectorate against Crix, this greater evil. The undead are threatening everybody. But it's sort of a shaky alliance. Like none of these guys really want to work together all that much. And we show this combined attack where like Signar is going in, they're doing fighting, and Vlad, who's in charge of the Khadorans, he kind of sends, they send in some of their forces, but it looks pretty clear that every side's like hoping the other ones will like get more people killed off than theirs. It's like, everybody's a little bit tentative to kind of go in full force. And basically like, the Signarans, who were kind of dupes, I guess in this case, like they're advancing in, they send out the signal. They're like, hey guys, let's all do it. Let's fight the Crix. Let's come on guys. And they send their signal and we show Hierarch Severius just kind of waiting, like he's not giving the order. And Durst's there with his guys, with his paladins and his warjacks, and he's like, I think that's the signal. I think we're supposed to go
fight. Guys.
Hey, are we? And he's waiting for the hierarch to give the order, and Severius is like, wait a minute, not yet. And then, but Durst sees like people dying and the undead are happening, and so he takes his guys in. And he goes into the fight. And we kind of, my favorite part of that is showing Krios's conflict, because he's the Grand Exemplar. He knows the plan. He knows that Durst could get killed here. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole thing, is like Durst is obeying the code even at the risk of his own life. And so he could potentially get killed off. And so Krios has to like politely tell Severius, like, that's a warcaster. Like maybe we should not have him get killed here. And Severius is like, okay, fine, go ahead, let's attack. But like if Krios hadn't been sympathetic toward the Order of the Wall and kind of, one of the fun parts of Krios's character is that he had been tempted to join the Order of the Wall, but had chosen instead to become an exemplar. Like his calling is the exemplar, and that really is what he is. But he's kind of like, paladin adjacent.
Yeah, he's shown a lot of respect for the Order of the Wall.
And he's one of our more sympathetic characters in general. Like he will sometimes, if he's given the option of executing his orders in a way that is somewhat merciful, he'll do it.
Right.
Like he's not always just burn, maim everybody.
Right.
Like certain other very enthusiastic military figures.
Absolutely.
Who really enjoy their flamethrowers
And fire.
and fire.
Yeah.
But that's not to say Krios will set people on fire if need be.
Yeah.
As will the paladins. There's certainly there's a time and place to set people on fire.
Mm-hmm.
But I really like that moment where Durst is not given an order to advance. He is technically operating outside of his authority in advancing into that fight, but he feels compelled to do it because of the code. Even as a warcaster who's more loyal to the hierarchy, more loyal to his place in the military structure, it's like the code takes precedence. And unfortunately, Krios, nudged Severius to with the notion of warcasters being irreplaceable military assets, to send in some Protectorate soldiers to make sure that Durst doesn't get murdered off in that moment.
So we've shown that since the fall of the Wall of Sul, there's been a slight resurgence in interest in the Order of the Wall.
Yeah, the defensive fighting in Sul, that is one of the kind of things that's fun, is we showed the Order of the Wall was in decline. Mm-hmm. Like the Screwtator caste, which was in charge, didn't value them very much. So they were in decline until the defense of Sul, where it's like, it kind of revitalized their order. They got some new recruits.
Right, and so we've seen that. I mean, the Devout Warjag originally was designed to kind of like do some replace the Paladins.
Yeah, because Paladins kind of served as bodyguards in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And it's difficult. But we've seen a lot of turmoil, like almost a pseudo civil war-y kind of thing in the Protectorate, and books like Godless and some of the other fiction. So. It's a question I ask for all of our subversive groups. Like, what is the future for the Order of the Wall, in your opinion? Like, how do they survive in the upcoming turmoil of the Protectorate?
I think we'll be seeing a real strong place for the Order of the Wall. I feel like things are the most dangerous for the Order of the Wall when things are going well for the Protectorate.
Oh yeah.
Because they are a defensive group. They're defending the wall. Like if I feel like the Paladins have a weird place in the Great Crusade, which is an offensive thing into other nations. Like that's not as much the Paladins' place. And so when you have threats to the Protectorate, that's where the Order of the Wall can thrive. And clearly, I don't want to get into it, but in Oblivion there might be some upcoming threats of a very nefarious, unholy type that are potentially threatening even the Protectorate.
Even the Protectorate.
And so when you have those kind of internal threats, plus, we've shown the rise of certain other sympathetic figures like Tristan, where you have warcasters and priest leaders who see the value of their beliefs. But I still do think they're very much a minority. Like they're definitely kind of in a niche position, and it's hard. Like I've always imagined Vilmon as somebody who very much would like to have a broader reformation of the Protectorate. Now, that's not to say that he doesn't think the Scrutators have their place,
right.
But clearly, like if you were to, in the old D&D days with alignments, one of the origins of these groups was we wanted to explore what does it mean to be like lawful evil or lawful good in the Protectorate. Clearly, lawful evil is a little stronger with the Scrutators, with the notion of people who are willing to do dark deeds to preserve the religion, and that is the far more powerful force. The Order of the Wall has much less influence. Like we've kind of shown that they might not be invited to all the meetings. Mm-hmm. Even the Grand Paladin, the guy who's in charge, he's kind of like we don't see him on camera very much at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think they're still sort of a fringe group, but they are important and they have a lot of support of the people, and so like they have enough support that it'd be very unpopular to just get rid of them entirely. But you do kind of have that sense of the Scrutators occasionally putting them in harm's way, or you set up those impossible decisions. You know which way the Paladin's going to go. It's not hard to kill off a Paladin if you want to.
Yeah, you just put them in a wrong, give our moral choice.
Yeah, exactly.
As lawful good people, that's what they'll do.
Right.
So we have a few questions.
Sure.
I'll give you a question before. Vilmon or Vinter? Who's the better swordsman?
It's a good question. Because there's so many like secondary factors involved.
The armor that Vinter wears, right?
Well, I think you gotta take out the armor,
right?
But like if you're looking just on pure skill, it's tough. Like I think they're real close. Like I mean, if you were to like, I think the advantages are like I think that Darton Vilmon probably has like pure form. Like he's flawless in his sword form. But I think like Vinter, one of the things we showed with Vinter that I think it'd be really tough to overcome is
that sixth sense kind of.
Yeah, it's almost like he can almost predict what his adversary is going to do.
Right.
And I think like he's also unconventional. Like I think he's more willing to do the dirty trick.
Cheat.
Not even just cheating, like just to do like he's not flawless. Like he will risk himself, and I think now the armor played into that a lot.
Right, like ancient mail of the Grim King.
He had armor that basically made him almost immortal, which you can take a couple of nicks and cuts pretty easily when you've got that. Whereas like if you're in a fight without any other kind of aid, you have to worry about stamina. Now one of the fun things about Vilmon is with his holy devotion, he has some similar protections in a different way. It's like trying to outlast Vilmon is almost as hard as trying to outlast somebody like Vinter. So I think I would give the slight edge to Vinter.
But so you're saying like 10 fights, 6 go to Vinter, 4 go to Vilmon.
Maybe 7 and 3.
7. That's not that close.
I think it's pretty good.
That's pretty good. And then we have a couple questions. So the No Quarter 39 was the Gavin Kaufman on Vilmon.
Yeah.
If you want to read about his trial.
Right.
And then that picture we showed was on the guts and gears of the Paladins, and I believe that was 52 or 53 issue of No Quarter. Go and get your, as a former No Quarter employee, get your back issues.
And a lot of, even if they're hard to find physical copies, all that stuff's still available in electronic form.
In electronic form.
In digital form.
And it's just a lot of really great background stuff we've done a guts and gears on Paladins. And,
right.
And I don't think we did one of the following group we're going to talk about. We've talked about them a lot, and that is the Scorn Extollers.
Yeah, that was going to be the third group. We're running a little low on time, but I'll get into this a little bit. The next group I wanted to talk about a little bit is the Extoller cast among the Scorn, and again, kind of to fit our overall scheme of something that is a part of the faction, a very important part of the faction, but still kind of subversive. Is the Extollers, and I love the Extollers. It's one of my favorite of our Scorn inventions, which is our sort of, we have our priest cast for a culture that doesn't believe in gods, and that has ancestor worship, and so you have the notion with the Extollers being like so important to that whole process. There's some ways in which even in our world, in the Iron Kingdoms, where gods are very provable and tangible. Sometimes the role of the priest feels a little abstracted and distant. You know they're important because they do funeral services and stuff, but sometimes it doesn't feel as direct as it does with the Extollers. Like the Extollers are very directly like talking to the ancestors that are preserved in sacral stones. They're the ones that are preserving, the ancestors of tomorrow. They're the ones who, when you fall, they decide who gets to become immortal and who doesn't.
And we talked about how they also train to interpret the ancestors, because they sometimes they lose their sanity being in these stones for.
Well, or their minds become different.
Yes.
It's not necessarily losing their sanity, but you do like especially the really old ancestors, like their minds become very different. Like their whole view of reality is very different, and so they might speak in sort of prophetic language, kind of like what we've shown with other oracle, oracular. Prophetic, incidents. But yeah, like the Extoller cast by itself is not subversive. It's an intrinsic core part of the Scorn culture. But then we have Zal, and Zal, I have to say, I've had a little bit of my own journey with Zal, because when we first started to introduce him. As a character, I remember kind of getting into an argument with Jason Souls about him because I was really looking forward to the notion of actually having like basically the Scorn Pope
Right.
as like a playable
Right.
warlock on the battlefield.
Right.
But then they wanted to introduce this whole Kovas mechanism, and I'm like, that's like really bad in Scorn religion. Like, that's like the worst thing that you could do. Like one of the worst things that you could do in Scorn culture
Is break a sacral.
is break a sacral stone to drive one of the Scorn ancestors, like one of their living, one of their gods, preserved gods, break their sacral stone, turn them into this horrific, maddened ghost spirit that then wants to destroy everything. Like it's honestly one of the worst things you can do in Scorn society. And here we have the Scorn Pope, who seems to be doing that on the regular, And so I remember being really bothered by that. And there's still some degree to where it's kind of messed up. But I've embraced the idea of it's kind of interesting that we're really seeing a massive change in the Extoller cast under Zal. He's been really shifting things in an interesting direction.
And let's be very specific before we get it forward. Extollers were not eligible for exaltation.
Right.
That was a thing. That's a big no-no.
Yeah. Well.
Until.
Well. So one of the things that's fun there, it's something that we've shown with both the Pain Givers and the Extoller casts in our Scorn culture, is these are ancient, well-established casts that have undergone major changes in the last few decades, where both of these casts were technically worker cast. And if you're a worker, it's helpful. Everybody appreciates the work that you do, but you don't get to be immortal. Like, you still end up, when you die, your soul goes on to the void for the nightmare eternity, because you're not a warrior.
Right.
Like, you got to be a warrior.
You didn't earn it
to be exalted.
That's right.
And so that's that big divide. And so, but the fun part with Zal is this technicality, which there is legitimate basis for. As this war into the West progressed, we see these casts that had normally been worker casts involved on the battlefield. And so you can't argue that Zal hasn't also been a warrior.
Right.
It's similar to what's going on with Hexeris. Like, he's like the Mortithurge is at its root, a Mortithurge is a worker.
Right.
But like, you have somebody like Hexeris who also kind of underwent cataphract training. He serves as a military leader. He's a tyrant of a house. Like, he is both a Mortithurge and a warrior. And so with Zal, the argument could be, well, yeah, he's an old guy, he's an extoller, he's mostly doing the extoller thing, but he's also occasionally, he might hit somebody with his stick on the battlefield. Technically, you could, I think it's a bit of a stretch to call Zal a warrior, but he did die in battle to the blades of his enemy.
That is true.
And he's self-exalted. Like, it's like he crawled as he's dying. It's like he's used his mortithurgy to like hang on just long enough to crawl over to like a stray sacral stone that was lying there, and basically transferred himself into it. Like, he basically gave himself the go-ahead. He's like, I'm the head of the Scorn religion. I think I'm probably worthy of exaltation. I think I've done enough.
And that opened the door for, now we've seen lower, extollers to start doing that.
Yeah, so the notion is, and again, the same thing kind of has happened with the Pain Givers, where we've seen this sort of warrior caste among the Pain Givers kind of start to gain legitimacy. They've sort of become their own house, and we see these reforms happening. But I do like there's all the suggestions, like if you read Zal's model entries in particular, that like, this is creating some ripples among the more conservative Scorn. Like, not everybody's in agreement that this is a good idea, but the problem is, like, if you're an extoller and you decide that maybe Zal made a mistake, maybe something bad happens to you. And so maybe you vanish, or maybe you're no longer an extoller anymore.
That's true.
So you do have this idea of this crackdown with Zal controlling the extoller caste that is, it's pretty dark in some ways, but you can also say that it's justified. Because one of the things I really like, again, we're getting low on time, but I like the idea that we've shown within Makita's entry. There's this complexity with Makita where she is extremely traditional, believes in the Haksun code, but she's also pragmatic, and she's embraced certain weapons that could be considered dubious,
right?
To traditionalists,
right?
And like, one of our greatest heresies in the Scorn is, I think it's Norvak. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but this whole heresy was based around a guy who had unleashed some Kovas in one of the oldest or the oldest Scorn city and killed all kinds of people. And so, that guy was doing basically what Zal was doing, but Zal considers that guy to have been kind of, he was weak. He didn't know how to control the Kovas.
Right.
He didn't know what he was doing.
Right.
And so you have to imagine these justifications happening with Zal, where he's like, maybe not every ancestor is as worthy as others. So maybe there's some that you kind of have like your tier of, you have your pile of sacral stones. There's some really good ones that you want to make sure you keep safe, but there could be some that aren't, like in the bargain bin.
Right.
Like in the sacral stone bargain bin. Yes, some ancestors that maybe not that great. Like, do you really need to keep them around? Or you have the Kovas, it's almost like a Scorn nuke. It's like, this is a special weapon that could mean victory, in these conflicts that the Scorn are engaging in. And so you have this notion of through Zal, and Makita, they've embraced the idea of occasionally maybe it's okay to break one of these sacral stones and use these weapons. So that's just kind of a conflict that I like, and it has some parallels, to some of our other factions where, occasionally you embrace the Death Star. Occasionally the weapon of ultimate destruction is something that you decide maybe isn't so bad after all. And so I think that's kind of what we have going on with Zal. And like I said, but it's not like he's a totally corrupted character either. He does believe in the Scorn traditions. He does exemplify the extoller caste. But he's definitely made certain concessions and embraced certain unconventional, unorthodox procedures.
So what does this mean for the future of extollers? And does it mean...
Well, it looks good.
Yeah, I mean, it looks good to be extoller.
As long as you back Zal, everything is good.
And does this mean potentially exaltation spreading beyond the warrior caste?
I think that what you see more is it's more the exceptions where you consider somebody a member of the warrior caste who wasn't previously. Like, I think that's more what we're seeing is like, and it works really well into the notion of conquest and fighting your enemies is like, if you can contribute enough to the war effort, if you're actively putting your life on the line, maybe you can earn exaltation. And so that gives opportunities that are in line with military expansion. Like, you're not probably going to see as many of those exceptions back in the safety of a Scorn house that isn't in the midst of conflict.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah. Do we have any other little questions as we're...
Well, I'm seeing a lot of questions about like various other groups. We don't have time to get into all of them.
Sure.
But like a lot of people asking about like cephalic secret societies, and you and I talked about the idea that like, well, it's really hard to have a secret society when everyone's kind of like psychic.
Well, and so, some of our cultures kind of embrace the idea of subversive groups.
Right.
Like in Crix, the Lich Lords are allowed to have their own special projects. Like, it's not considered subversive unless you go against Torek.
Right. Asphyxious' whole thing
is... even there, Asphyxious kind of went against Torek, and Torek was like, no, it's okay, like, you shut him down, he didn't become a god. We'll keep him around, he's still handy. And similarly, like in the Circle of Ouroboros, we have all kind of scheming groups. And so some of the notion is, with some of these factions, as long as you're still working toward the greater goals of the faction, you're allowed a lot of leeway. And
there's a lot, and there's some factions that kind of started as subversive or secretive things, like the Retribution was technically...
Yeah, I'd like to get into the Retribution in general. Like there's a whole rabbit hole in the Retribution with secret societies, because like one of my favorite things in the Retribution is the third chamber, with Alara, and just the notion of, so we have the Retribution, which was like already a fringe cult within Iosan society. That was kind of had their own interpretation of the goddess. They even have like their own statues of the goddess that are different. And then within them, you've got this assassin sub-society that has that worships, the goddess of autumn, who is the assassin of the gods.
Yeah, Lilith.
And so Lilith has her own cult. And we had a chance to get into that in Rites of Passage, which was the novella that I wrote for Alara, and I really enjoyed getting into that cult a little bit, where they're sort of a death cult within the Retribution. And so I do quite like the notion of this sort of rabbit hole idea of the Retribution becoming a mainstay organization as part of Iosan society. Now they've taken over the military, but within the Retribution, you also have sort of a subversive cult that isn't, they still worship Syra and respect her, but their true spiritual reverence seems to be toward Aisla, the goddess of autumn, who is vanished and thought to be gone.
And then other groups like
the third chamber,
like the Convergence was kind of considered to be fringy a little bit, right?
Well, not just a little bit.
Even within Cyrus worshippers, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a fun thing with the Convergence where like they're sort of like they were the hidden majority. That's not necessarily true, but like the deeper cult is the more powerful aspect of the religion. Like we have on the fringes of the Convergence all of these different little small worshippers of Sirius that are fairly innocuous, and they're just like mathematics professors at the university or people who like to look at through telescopes at the night sky. But then, meanwhile, there's this deeper, larger group that's recruiting from those guys into the Convergence, which is slowly getting larger just by dint of making immortal robot people.
Right.
And so
it's a good way of getting bigger.
Yeah, well, it's good when you don't die.
That's true.
But yeah, so there's all kinds of other groups that we could talk about. Were there any other questions any specific questions that we wanted to answer?
Let's see. Well, someone did ask about Rulic secret societies, and I'll just say like the Glommering is probably
sure.
Which is a group really of spies.
Right. There's even if they aren't as secretive, we do have some specialized societies that have their own rituals and traditions. Like I've always wanted to get into the Brand of Odom more.
My favorite.
Which is basically, that's like the arcanists of Rule are the Brand of Odom, and they have very strict rules and regulations. Like we haven't had a chance to really see them on the tabletop because they're, the closest we have is
the Tactical Arcanist Corps.
Tactical Arcanist Corps. But the notion is within the context of mercenaries, it feels a little bit of a divide. But like the Brand of Odom is basically an occult organization within Rule.
But also a religious organization too, right?
Religion, yeah, because they worship the Great Father. Odom, who is the one who like bestowed magic on Rule folk, and so they're another one that could have qualified for our talk today, where they're a part of mainstream society, but they're kind of left to do their own thing, and they're the ones that are like, we've talked before about how Rule has kind of made out well compared to some of our other nations in avoiding a lot of the conflicts and problems because their society is so stable. And similarly, like, in Ios, you have them like breaking the continent because of doing these crazy over-the-top public work projects, but when they're and getting too much access to magic.
Right.
The Brand of Odom kind of had all these rules and regulations about magic that seem to have kept them intact from things like what happened to Ios, or we've shown that maybe like there's not as much infernalism in Rule. I wouldn't say there's no infernalism, but the Brand of Odom has kept infernalism to a minimum, we'll say, in Rule because of that strict regulation and control of magic.
Right.
So yeah, there's definitely all kinds of secret societies in each of our factions. But yeah. I do, like I said, I think it'll be a recurring topic just because I love our little weird societies and groups, and we we like conspiracies and
love them.
So anyway, well, I'm sure that's something we'll return to again. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed our little subversive society talk.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for making my final lore chat.
All right. Well, we'll see. Maybe come back,
maybe
special guest.
Come back. Maybe a special guest. You never know.
Yeah.
But thank you guys so much. And,
yep.
And of course, we need to get to the final subversive group at Privateer Press, which is the writing and editing department.
Yes.
Like the writers having to work so hard to get things through.
Yes.
Against some of our lead designers, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, there is an ongoing conflict between the dev team.
The eternal war.
And the eternal war and the writers. Usually the dev team wins.
Usually.
So.
But sometimes we sneak something in.
Right. All right, guys.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, take care.
See you next time.
Well, yeah, I barely got to the extollers. I had a feeling. Glad we didn't try to do 4.
I know. But we still talked about this a little bit.